The salty air whipped Sarah's hair around her face as she stood before the imposing structure. The lighthouse, a stark silhouette against the stormy sky, loomed like a watchful guardian over the desolate coastline. A sense of unease settled in her gut, a prickling sensation that sent shivers down her spine. She had come to this remote seaside town seeking answers, a place that seemed to echo with a haunting past. The lighthouse was a constant presence in the victims' lives, a shared link that drew them together in the killer's macabre game. Sarah had to uncover the secrets of this towering sentinel, the truth that was buried deep within its stone walls. She found herself staring at the faded photograph that had been found near the first victim's body, a picture of a group of young people laughing and smiling on the steps of the lighthouse. Their faces, now blurred with time, seemed to whisper tales of a carefree youth, a stark contrast to the tragedy that had unfolded in this very place. A local historian, a wizened old man named Mr. Hawthorne, agreed to meet her at the town's quaint coffee shop. He spoke of the lighthouse with a mixture of reverence and sorrow, his voice trembling as he shared the tragic story of a group of young people who had died in a freak accident decades ago. "It was a storm," he said, his eyes glinting with unshed tears. "The worst storm this town had ever seen. They were young, full of life. Working at the lighthouse, the waves crashed over the cliffs, tearing away a part of the tower. The lighthouse keeper. He was a good man, but he couldn't save them all." Sarah listened intently, piecing together the fragments of the past. She learned that the lighthouse had been a place of tragedy, a place where lives had been cruelly snatched away. The victims of the 7-day killer had all worked at the lighthouse, and their deaths seemed to be a twisted echo of that fateful storm. "What happened to the lighthouse keeper?" she asked, her voice low. "Did he survive the storm?" Mr. Hawthorne shook his head. "He lost his wife and daughter in that storm," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "He never recovered. He died a few years later, his heart broken, his mind shattered." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The lighthouse keeper, a man haunted by loss, a man who had witnessed unimaginable tragedy, had been the last one to see the victims alive. Could he be the key to understanding the 7-day killer? Could he have been the one to set the deadly game in motion? As she delved deeper into the past, she discovered that the lighthouse had a reputation for being haunted. Local fishermen claimed to have seen ghostly figures on the cliffs, and there were whispers of strange occurrences within the lighthouse itself. The locals were convinced that the spirits of the victims were trapped within the lighthouse, unable to find peace. Some believed that the lighthouse keeper's ghost still walked the corridors, consumed by guilt and sorrow. Sarah found herself drawn to the lighthouse, the mystery surrounding it like a magnetic force. She needed to step inside, to walk the same paths the victims had walked, to feel the shadows of the past. She contacted the current lighthouse keeper, a gruff, stoic man named William. He was a seasoned seafarer with a weathered face and a piercing gaze. He agreed to let her visit the lighthouse, but he warned her about the dangers of the sea. He had seen too many storms, too many tragedies. Sarah entered the lighthouse with a mix of trepidation and excitement. The air inside was thick with the scent of salt and damp stone. She found herself walking through the same corridors the victims had walked, the same rooms where they had worked and laughed. The lighthouse keeper's old journal, a leather-bound book filled with faded ink, sat on a dusty table. She opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the lines of the keeper's meticulous handwriting. He had chronicled his life, his joys and sorrows, his love for his family, his despair over their loss. But there was something else in the journal, something that sent a shiver down her spine. He had written about a secret he had kept hidden for years. He had written about his obsession with one of the victims, a young woman named Lily. The journal detailed his love for Lily, his longing for her, his jealousy of the other men in her life. He had been consumed by his desire for her, unable to control his emotions. And he had been tormented by the guilt of her death, convinced that he could have done more to save her. The entries were filled with anguish and despair. The keeper's soul laid bare on the pages. He had never spoken of this secret to anyone, not even after his wife's and daughter's deaths. He had carried the burden of his love and his guilt with him to his grave. Sarah realized that she had stumbled upon a clue, a piece of the puzzle that could unravel the mystery of the 7-day killer. The lighthouse keeper's secret was not just a personal tragedy. It was a dark secret that had the potential to unravel the killer's motives. The connection between the lighthouse keeper's obsession with Lily and the 7-day killer seemed undeniable. Could the keeper's secret be the key to stopping the killings? Could his tormented spirit be the driving force behind the killer's actions? Sarah's mind raced as she read through the journal entries, each word bringing her closer to the truth. She knew that she had to find the killer, but she also knew that she had to be careful. The killer was a master manipulator, a player in a deadly game, and he was watching her every move. The salty air whipped Sarah's hair around her face as she stood at the foot of the weathered lighthouse, its silhouette stark against the turbulent gray sky. It felt like a monument to tragedy, a silent sentinel guarding secrets that had been locked away for decades. The town of Sea Haven, once a bustling hub of fishing activity, now wore an air of melancholic resignation. The once vibrant harbor, now a skeletal framework of decaying piers, reflected the town's collective grief, a reminder of the lives lost in the tragic accident that had forever stained the lighthouse's history. The lighthouse keeper, a man named Silas, had been a fixture in Sea Haven for as long as anyone could remember. A weathered, solitary figure with a deep, knowing gaze, he had witnessed the town's transformation from a thriving community to a ghost of its former self. His silence, as impenetrable as the lighthouse's stone walls, had always been a source of fascination and unease for the townsfolk. The air around him was thick with an unspoken past, a sense of sorrow that clung to him like a shroud. Sarah had learned about Silas from the town's oldest resident, a frail, silver-haired woman named Agnes, who lived in a small, ramshackle cottage overlooking the harbor. Agnes's eyes, clouded with time and grief, had held a flicker of recognition when Sarah mentioned the lighthouse. "Silas," Agnes had whispered, her voice hoarse. "He's been there since before the accident." He was just a boy then, but he saw it all. The lighthouse, it changed him. The accident, as it was euphemistically called, had been a horrific event that claimed the lives of 6 young people, all of whom had worked at the lighthouse. It was said that the lighthouse had been struck by lightning during a violent storm, sending the beacon crashing down, trapping the young workers within the crumbling structure. Sarah pressed Agnes for more details. The woman's recollections, however, were fragmented and often contradictory, as if her memory had been scarred by the tragedy. She spoke of a young man named Silas, who had been working at the lighthouse at the time, and his unyielding grief, a despair so profound that it had consumed him, leaving him a shell of his former self. She spoke of his haunted eyes, his silence, a refusal to speak of the tragedy, a refusal to live in the town that had been his sanctuary, but had now become a crucible of grief. "Silas was a good boy," Agnes had said, her voice choked with tears. "He loved the lighthouse. He loved the sea." The lighthouse, once a beacon of hope, had become a monument to loss, a silent reminder of the town's collective trauma. As Sarah looked at the towering structure, she felt a chill crawl down her spine. She knew that the secrets hidden within the lighthouse's walls were the key to unraveling the 7-day killer's macabre game. She needed to find Silas, to delve into his past, to understand the connection between the lighthouse's history and the murders. Sarah's investigation took her to the lighthouse's keeper's cottage, a modest dwelling nestled beneath the lighthouse's shadow. It was a place that seemed to radiate a palpable sense of solitude, a feeling of isolation that resonated with the keeper's reclusive nature. She knocked hesitantly, a wave of anxiety washing over her. The door creaked open, revealing Silas, his face a mask of stoic impassiveness. His eyes, as deep and dark as the sea that surrounded the lighthouse, held a chilling intensity that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. The silence between them felt heavy, oppressive, a tangible manifestation of the sorrow that had clung to Silas for years. "You're the journalist," Silas said, his voice a gravelly rasp. "The one who's sniffing around my past." Sarah, taken aback by his bluntness, forced herself to remain composed. "I'm here to understand the events of the past, Mr. Silas," she said, her voice calm, "to understand what happened here, at the lighthouse, so many years ago." Silas's eyes narrowed, his expression unreadable. "The past is best left buried," he said, his voice low and menacing. "It's a graveyard of memories, filled with ghosts that are better left undisturbed." He closed the door in her face, leaving Sarah standing alone, her heart pounding in her chest. The encounter had only fueled her determination. She knew that Silas held the key to unraveling the 7-day killer's twisted game, and she wouldn't rest until she had unlocked his secrets. Sarah decided to return to the lighthouse later, armed with a plan. She knew she couldn't confront him directly. He was a man who had been deeply wounded by the tragedy, and he was clearly guarding his past with a ferocity that bordered on madness. She needed a different approach, a way to coax information from him without triggering his defenses. She spent the next few days poring over old newspaper articles, interviewing local historians, piecing together a timeline of the lighthouse's history. She learned that the lighthouse had been built in the late 19th century, a beacon of hope for ships navigating the treacherous waters of the North Sea. It had stood as a symbol of safety and guidance for decades, its light a reassuring presence in the stormy night. Then, the tragedy had struck. The lightning strike, the raging fire, the 6 young lives lost. The tragedy had cast a long shadow over Seahaven, a dark mark on the lighthouse's history. Sarah discovered that the victims, all young men and women in their early 20s, had been working at the lighthouse as part of a summer program designed to give them practical experience in maritime navigation. They were all bright, ambitious, full of life, and their deaths had left a gaping hole in the town's fabric. Sarah discovered that Silas, a young lighthouse apprentice at the time, had been the only survivor of the accident. He had been away from the lighthouse on a supply run when the storm hit. He returned to find the beacon ablaze, the screams of the trapped workers echoing in the night. He had been unable to save them. The tragedy had devastated him, leaving him with a deep-seated guilt, a feeling that he had failed those who had depended on him. He had retreated into himself, shunning the town that had once been his home. He had become the lighthouse's keeper, his solitude as vast as the ocean that surrounded him. Sarah realized that Silas's grief, his guilt, his isolation, were all intertwined with the lighthouse's history. She suspected that the 7-day killer was targeting victims who had been connected to the lighthouse in some way, and that Silas, the only survivor of the tragedy, held the key to understanding the killer's motivations. Sarah returned to the lighthouse, this time not to confront him, but to observe him, to study his routine, to understand the depths of his sorrow. She spent hours watching him from a distance, watching him move around the lighthouse, his movements stiff and mechanical, as if he were a ghost haunting the halls of his own memories. She saw him tending the light, his face drawn and weary, his gaze lost in the distance, as if he was seeing not the sea, but a vision of the past. One evening, she saw Silas leave the lighthouse, heading towards the town. Sarah followed him at a distance, keeping her distance, her curiosity piqued. She watched him enter a small pub, its interior filled with the warm glow of firelight and the murmur of conversation. He sat alone at a table in the corner, his head bowed, his hands clenched into fists. Sarah approached him cautiously, her voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Silas," she said, "I need to talk to you." Silas looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He seemed to shrink back in his chair, as if she had caught him in a moment of vulnerability. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice tense, his gaze wary. Sarah had planned to be more subtle, but the urgency of the situation, the looming threat of the 7-day killer, forced her to be direct. "I need to know what happened at the lighthouse," she said. "I need to understand the tragedy, to understand the connection to the murders. I need your help." Silas hesitated, his eyes searching hers, his face a study in uncertainty. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "You know," Sarah pressed, her voice firm but gentle. "You were there, you saw it all. You know the truth, Mr. Silas. I'm asking you to share it." Silas's eyes narrowed, his expression hardening. "The truth," he whispered. "There's no such thing. The truth is just another ghost haunting the past." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor, a grating sound that seemed to echo the turmoil within him. He walked out of the pub, leaving Sarah alone, the weight of his silence heavy in the air. She knew she was on the right track, but Silas's resistance had only strengthened her determination. She had to find a way to get him to talk, to unlock the secrets he had buried for so long. The night was cold and windswept, the lighthouse's light piercing the darkness like a solitary eye. Sarah, with a renewed sense of purpose, walked towards the lighthouse, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. She knew that Silas would not be easily persuaded, but she had to try, to confront the ghosts of the past that haunted him, to uncover the truth that lay buried beneath the layers of grief and silence. Sarah spent the next few days observing Silas, studying his routine, looking for any sign of weakness, any crack in his emotional armor. She observed the way he moved around the lighthouse, the way he interacted with the town's few remaining inhabitants, the way he spoke, the way he thought. She was trying to build a picture of the man, to understand his motivations, to find a way to connect with him on a deeper level. She learned that he had a fondness for the sea, that he spent hours sitting on the cliffs, gazing out at the waves, his face a mask of melancholic contemplation. She learned that he kept a small, dusty garden behind his cottage, where he grew herbs and vegetables, a testament to the small, fragile hope that still flickered within him. Sarah decided to try a different approach. She knew that confronting him directly would only trigger his defenses, so she chose a different path, a path of empathy, of understanding, of shared sorrow. She sat on the cliffs, gazing out at the sea, allowing the wind to whip her hair around her face, the spray of the waves to cool her skin. She thought of the lighthouse, of its tragic history, of the 6 young lives lost in the inferno, and of the profound grief that Silas had carried for so long. Later that evening, she returned to Silas's cottage, a basket of freshly baked bread in her hand. She knew it was a simple gesture, but it was a way to express her respect, her understanding, her desire to connect. She knocked gently, her heart pounding in her chest. Silas opened the door, his face wary, his eyes clouded with the weariness of a lifetime spent mourning. He looked at the basket, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. "For you," Sarah said, her voice soft, her eyes meeting his. "I baked some bread." Silas hesitated for a moment. Then he nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the basket. He took it from her, a flicker of gratitude passing over his face. "Thank you," he said, his voice a mere rasp. Sarah smiled, a small, genuine smile that softened her features. "You're welcome," she said, her gaze lingering on him. I know you're in pain, Mr. Silas. I want to help. Silas looked at her, his expression guarded, his eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sorrow. He led her into his cottage, a small, sparsely furnished space that felt like a refuge from the world, a place where he had retreated to grieve his losses. I can't change the past, he said, his voice barely audible. But I can try to find some peace. Sarah nodded in agreement, her heart aching for the man's pain. She sat down on a worn armchair, her eyes drawn to the photographs on the mantelpiece. Faded images of a younger Silas, his face full of life, his eyes bright with hope. She saw a picture of him with a group of young people, the lighthouse in the background, their faces filled with youthful exuberance, their smiles wide and carefree. Sarah's gaze lingered on the photograph, her mind racing. The group of young people in the picture, could they be the victims of the lighthouse tragedy? Was there a connection between the photograph, the lighthouse, and the 7-day killer? Silas noticed her gaze, a flicker of sadness crossing his face. That was a long time ago, he said, his voice filled with regret, a time before the accident. He stood up, his face a mask of pain, his hands clenched into fists. He walked to the window, his back to Sarah, gazing out at the storm-tossed sea. Sarah knew he was wrestling with the memories of the past, with the guilt and the grief that had haunted him for so long. "Tell me about the accident," Sarah said, her voice a gentle whisper. "Tell me what happened." Silas's shoulders slumped, his body sagging with the weight of his grief. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with a deep, abiding sorrow. He spoke of the storm, of the lightning strike, of the fire, of the screams, of the desperate struggle to save those who were trapped within the lighthouse's stone walls. He spoke of the guilt, of the burden of his survival, of the feeling that he had been spared while others had been lost. He spoke of his isolation, of his decision to retreat from the town, to seek solace in the solitude of the lighthouse, to find peace in the vast, empty space that stretched before him. As Silas spoke, Sarah felt a wave of empathy washing over her. She understood the depth of his grief, the weight of his guilt, the profound sadness that had consumed him. She knew that he was a man who had been broken by tragedy, a man who was struggling to piece together the fragments of a shattered life. She sat there, listening to him, offering him a silent space to grieve, a space to confront the past, a space to find some measure of peace. She knew that he wasn't ready to talk about the murders, that he was still wrestling with the ghosts of his past. But she had opened a door, a small crack in his defenses, a sliver of hope that he might be willing to share the truth, to shed light on the darkness that had haunted him for so long. Sarah stood at the edge of the weathered pier, the salty wind whipping at her hair. The lighthouse loomed before her, a stark silhouette against the stormy sky. Its whitewashed walls were worn and cracked, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the churning sea. It was a place steeped in history, but also in shadows. The tragedy that had unfolded within its walls, decades ago, resonated through the whispers of the wind, a chilling reminder of the darkness that could lurk beneath the surface. She had come to the seaside town searching for answers, for the truth that lay hidden within the labyrinthine corridors of the lighthouse. The victims, connected by the faded photograph of the lighthouse, had all been employed there years ago. It was a connection that Sarah couldn't ignore, a thread that she knew would lead her to the heart of the mystery. Sarah walked along the pier, her eyes scanning the weathered planks, searching for any trace of the past. She imagined the victims, young and vibrant, working within the lighthouse's walls, their lives forever intertwined with this imposing structure. The tragedy that had befallen them, a freak accident that had claimed their lives, had left a lasting mark on the town, a wound that never truly healed. The local newspaper, brittle with age, chronicled the tragedy. A group of young lighthouse employees, caught in a sudden storm, had been swept away by a rogue wave. The keeper, an old man with a troubled past, had been the sole survivor. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as she read the article. The keeper, a man shrouded in mystery, had disappeared shortly after the tragedy, his whereabouts unknown. Intrigued, Sarah decided to delve into the keeper's past. She contacted the local historical society, hoping to find some clues about the man who had once been the guardian of the lighthouse. The archivist, a wizened woman with a keen eye for detail, presented Sarah with a dusty file filled with faded photographs and yellowed documents. The keeper's name was Jonathan Blake, a man of few words and a troubled past. The records revealed that he had served as a lighthouse keeper for decades, his life consumed by the isolation and solitude of his solitary post. He had a reputation for being a recluse, his days spent tending to the lighthouse's beacon and observing the ever-changing moods of the sea. The archivist mentioned that Blake had a strained relationship with the townsfolk, a reputation for being aloof and unapproachable. There were whispers about his past, rumors of a dark secret that he carried with him, like a heavy weight that he could never escape. Sarah's curiosity grew. Blake, with his mysterious past and his connection to the victims, seemed like a potential suspect. Determined to learn more about Blake, Sarah visited the local bar, a place where the town's residents gathered to share gossip and stories. She sat at the counter, ordering a glass of water and listening to the conversations around her. The barkeeper, a burly man with a gruff demeanor, seemed to be a repository of local knowledge. Sarah casually mentioned Blake's name, testing the waters. The barkeeper's eyes narrowed, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He leaned in, his voice a low growl. "Blake," he muttered. "He was a strange one, that's for sure. Kept to himself, always shrouded in darkness. Some say he lost his wife at sea, others say he was responsible for her death." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The barkeeper's words, though veiled in ambiguity, were chilling. They hinted at a deeper truth, a hidden darkness that lay beneath Blake's seemingly simple life. Was he truly responsible for his wife's death, as some suggested? And what connection, if any, did he have to the current killings? Sarah continued her investigation, piecing together the fragments of information about Blake. She discovered that he had been a skilled sailor, a man who had braved the treacherous seas for years. But after his wife's disappearance, he had abandoned his life at sea, taking refuge in the solitude of the lighthouse. She visited the cemetery, a place of solemn stillness where the town's deceased residents found their final resting place. She scanned the weathered tombstones, searching for Blake's wife's grave. Finally, she found it, a simple marker with a single name etched upon it: Amelia Blake. The inscription on the tombstone was brief, but it provided Sarah with a glimpse into the life that Blake had lost. Amelia Blake, a woman who had shared his life at sea, had been taken from him in a sudden and tragic accident. Sarah imagined the pain that Blake must have endured, the loss that had forever scarred his soul. But something about the inscription felt off, a subtle incongruity that sparked a flicker of suspicion in Sarah's mind. The date of Amelia Blake's death, according to the tombstone, was a few years after the lighthouse tragedy that had claimed the lives of the young employees. Sarah returned to the library, determined to uncover the truth about Amelia Blake's death. She scoured the newspaper archives, searching for any mention of her disappearance or the circumstances surrounding her death. But she found nothing. It was as if Amelia Blake had vanished without a trace, her story lost to the tides of time. The more Sarah investigated, the more convinced she became that something wasn't right. The timeline didn't add up, and the lack of information surrounding Amelia Blake's death seemed suspicious. Could it be that the barkeeper's whispers had been more than just gossip? Could Blake have been responsible for his wife's death, a possibility that had been hushed up and hidden from public view? Sarah's suspicions began to crystallize, forming a disturbing picture of a man driven by darkness and a past shrouded in secrets. Jonathan Blake, the mysterious lighthouse keeper, was now a prime suspect in Sarah's investigation. She was convinced that he held the key to unraveling the mystery of the 7-day killer, and she would stop at nothing to uncover the truth. As Sarah delved deeper into Blake's life, she discovered another startling detail. The lighthouse, which had been the setting for the tragedy that had claimed young employees, was also where Blake had lived with his wife, Amelia. It was a place where he had been consumed by the solitude and darkness of his solitary existence, a place where secrets could be hidden, and where the echoes of the past could linger. The lighthouse, once a beacon of hope, now stood as a symbol of the darkness that had consumed Blake. It was a place where the lines between reality and memory blurred, where the whispers of the wind carried the ghosts of the past. Sarah's mind raced, piecing together the fragments of information she had gathered. The lighthouse tragedy, the missing wife, the whispers of a dark secret, the connection to the victims, all pointed towards Jonathan Blake. He was a man haunted by the past, driven by a force that Sarah could only begin to comprehend. The next day, Sarah decided to pay a visit to the lighthouse. She wanted to see the place where Blake had spent his years, to feel the atmosphere that had shaped him, to understand the secrets that lay hidden within its walls. The lighthouse keeper, a grizzled old man with a weathered face and a piercing gaze, stood guard at the entrance. He eyed Sarah with suspicion, his lips pressed into a thin line. "No visitors allowed," he growled. Sarah pressed on, explaining her purpose. "I'm an investigative journalist," she said, her voice firm. "I'm working on a story about the lighthouse tragedy. I need to talk to the former keeper, Jonathan Blake." The keeper's gaze remained fixed on Sarah, unyielding and cold. "He's dead," he muttered, his voice a raspy whisper. "Passed away years ago." Sarah's heart sank. But something in the keeper's words, the subtle hesitation in his voice, the way he avoided her gaze, made her doubt his story. She wasn't ready to give up on Blake. Not yet. She continued to press the keeper, demanding to know more about Blake, about his life, about his death. The keeper remained evasive, his responses brief and uninformative. He seemed to be hiding something, a secret that he was desperately trying to protect. Sarah refused to be deterred. She knew that she was on the right track, that Blake was the key to solving the mystery. She decided to take a different approach, using her skills as an investigative journalist to bypass the keeper's resistance. She contacted the local police department, providing them with the information she had gathered about Blake. She also asked them to check his death certificate to verify the keeper's claims. She knew that the police, with their access to resources and their authority, could help her uncover the truth. As she waited for the police to respond, Sarah decided to take a walk around the lighthouse. She circled the building, examining its weathered walls, its rusted gates, its solitary windows. The lighthouse was a place of isolation and secrets, a perfect hiding place for someone seeking to escape the scrutiny of the outside world. She approached the lighthouse's entrance, noticing a small, dilapidated shed nestled beside the building. The shed was filled with old tools and equipment, remnants of the lighthouse's past. As Sarah rummaged through the clutter, she came across a dusty box tucked away in a corner. Curiosity piqued. Sarah opened the box. Inside, she found a collection of old photographs, letters, and personal belongings. The photographs showed a younger Jonathan Blake, a man with a handsome face and a piercing gaze. He was often pictured with his wife, Amelia, a woman with long, flowing hair and a radiant smile. Sarah felt a pang of sympathy for the couple, their happiness captured in the photographs, their lives forever intertwined with the lighthouse. But as she examined the photographs more closely, a chilling realization dawned on her. The dates on the back of the photographs were a few years before the lighthouse tragedy that had claimed the lives of the young employees. It meant that the keeper's story about Blake's death was a lie. Blake hadn't passed away years ago, as the keeper had claimed. He was still alive, and he was hiding somewhere. Sarah's heart raced as she continued to sift through the box. She found a series of letters, written in a neat, elegant script. The letters were addressed to Amelia Blake, but the content was disturbing, filled with accusations of infidelity, threats of revenge, and expressions of deep-seated resentment. As Sarah read the letters, she felt a wave of nausea wash over her. They painted a picture of a man consumed by jealousy and rage, a man who had been driven to the brink of madness by his wife's supposed infidelity. The letters provided Sarah with a crucial piece of the puzzle. Blake, driven by his obsession with his wife, had been consumed by a dark and destructive force. It was clear now that he had been responsible for Amelia's disappearance, and he was now using the tragedy at the lighthouse as a cover for his crimes. Sarah had finally uncovered the truth about Jonathan Blake, the lighthouse keeper. He wasn't just a man who had lost his wife at sea. He was a man who had murdered her, consumed by jealousy and a desire for revenge. With the evidence she had gathered, Sarah knew that she had to act quickly. She couldn't let Blake get away with his crimes. She had to expose his true nature and bring him to justice. The police arrived at the lighthouse, alerted by Sarah's tip. The officers, skeptical at first, were convinced when they saw the evidence Sarah had found. They arrested the keeper, who admitted to his crimes, revealing that he had hidden Amelia's body in a secret chamber within the lighthouse. The revelation of Blake's crimes sent shockwaves through the seaside town. The truth, hidden for years, had finally come to light, exposing the darkness that had lurked beneath the surface of the lighthouse. The 7-day killer was finally unmasked. The mystery of the lighthouse tragedy had been solved, and the secrets of the lighthouse had been revealed. But as the case closed, a chilling truth lingered, a reminder of the darkness that could reside within the human heart. The sea air whipped Sarah's hair across her face as she stood on the cliff overlooking the old, weathered lighthouse. The waves crashed against the rocks below, a relentless rhythm that mirrored the pounding in her chest. The lighthouse, a stark, imposing structure against the darkening sky, was more than just a landmark. It was a monument to secrets, a silent witness to the chilling events that had unfolded in its shadow. Days had turned into weeks since she'd stumbled upon the faded photograph of the lighthouse, a seemingly insignificant detail amidst the gruesome details of the first murder. That single photo, however, had become the catalyst that had sent her down a rabbit hole of secrets and lies, leading her to this desolate corner of the coast. The lighthouse, with its weathered stone walls and creaking timbers, had become a symbol of both the past and the present, its history intertwined with the sinister game the killer was playing. She knew the killer was targeting former lighthouse employees, each victim connected to the tragic event that had haunted this place for decades. But what was the connection? What drove this killer to meticulously orchestrate these murders, seemingly driven by a twisted form of revenge? As she traced the worn lines of the lighthouse with her eyes, her mind raced with the details of the most recent victim, Thomas, the former lighthouse keeper's son. He had been found in his workshop, his death as gruesome as the others, but with a peculiar twist. A single seashell, found near his body, held a small handwritten note. The note was brief, cryptic, and unsettling. It read, "The tide has turned. The past will not be buried." The words echoed in Sarah's mind, confirming her growing suspicion. The killer was not simply targeting those connected to the lighthouse. He was using the lighthouse as a stage, each victim a pawn in a macabre play of revenge. But who was the puppeteer behind this twisted game? She recalled the whispers she had heard in the town about the former lighthouse keeper, a man shrouded in mystery and rumors. He had disappeared shortly after the tragedy, leaving behind a trail of whispers and speculation. The locals spoke of a dark secret that had driven him from his home, a secret that had seemingly been buried beneath the waves along with the victims of the past. The tide had turned, the note had warned. But was it a warning to the killer, a sign of a shift in power? Or was it a message to Sarah, a clue that she had not yet discovered? Days of relentless investigation had left her exhausted, but she knew she couldn't afford to rest. Each moment felt like a countdown, a ticking clock that was moving closer to the killer's next move. The pattern had become clear. The murders occurred on specific days of the week, always during the same hour. The killer was following a schedule, a grim ritual that he had carefully choreographed. The next victim, she realized, was not a matter of if but when. Driven by a sense of urgency, Sarah returned to the quaint seaside town. She had hoped to find answers, to piece together the puzzle that the killer had so carefully crafted. Instead, she found herself facing a town steeped in fear, its inhabitants whispering amongst themselves, casting nervous glances at the towering lighthouse that stood sentinel over their lives. The police, still baffled by the murders, were no closer to apprehending the killer. Their efforts seemed to be limited to a series of dead-end leads and frustratingly futile investigations. Sarah, however, was determined to find the truth, even if it meant going against the grain. Venturing into the darkness that lurked beneath the surface of the seemingly peaceful town. She began her investigation, meticulously interviewing the locals, seeking any shred of information that might lead her to the killer. Her search focused on the lighthouse, its secrets, and the people who had been connected to its past. She scoured local archives, piecing together the tragic story of the lighthouse and its inhabitants, desperately seeking answers to the questions that gnawed at her mind. The town's history, she discovered, was steeped in tragedy. The lighthouse, a beacon of hope for sailors navigating the treacherous waters, had witnessed a dark side of human nature. The tragedy that had taken the lives of several young people had shattered the town's tranquility, leaving a scar that had never fully healed. The more she dug, the more she realized that the lighthouse was not just a monument to a tragedy. It was a mirror reflecting the dark side of human nature. It was a place where secrets had festered, where whispers had turned into rumors, and where the line between truth and fiction had become blurred. Sarah knew she had to tread carefully, each step taking her closer to the edge of a dangerous precipice. The killer was playing a game, but she was determined to be the one who called the shots. She had to be the one who broke the pattern, who defied the clockwork precision of the killer's twisted game. The pressure was immense. The clock was ticking, and the shadow of the lighthouse loomed over her, a silent reminder of the darkness that awaited her. She knew the killer was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike again. But Sarah was not going to let him win. She was going to unravel his deadly game, expose his secrets, and bring him to justice, even if it meant facing her own demons in the process. The salty air whipped Sarah's hair around her face as she stood on the windswept cliff overlooking the lighthouse. The towering structure, once a beacon of hope, now seemed to cast a long shadow of menace over the quaint seaside town. The lighthouse had become the epicenter of a macabre game, its haunting history playing a sinister role in the brutal murders that had gripped the city. Sarah's journey to this remote corner of the coast had begun with a single photograph, a faded image of the lighthouse, found near the body of the first victim. Each subsequent victim, seemingly unrelated, had also been connected to the lighthouse, each discovery unraveling another layer of a chilling puzzle. She traced the history of the lighthouse back to its inception, discovering that it had served as a vital navigation point for sailors in the treacherous waters surrounding the coast. Yet, its past held a dark secret, a tragedy that had unfolded decades ago, claiming the lives of several young people who had worked at the lighthouse. The tragedy, a freak accident, had left a deep scar on the town. The lighthouse, once a symbol of hope and safety, had become a silent witness to the loss and despair that had befallen the community. Sarah, however, saw an opportunity in this tragedy. The lighthouse, with its dark history, held the key to unraveling the current murders. Delving into the archives, Sarah uncovered a trove of information about the lighthouse and its past inhabitants. She meticulously pieced together the events of the tragedy, interviewing surviving witnesses and piecing together the fragmented memories of those who had been affected by the loss. Her investigation took her to the local historical society, where she found dusty records and crumbling photographs that chronicled the lighthouse's history. Among the records, Sarah found a faded photograph of the lighthouse keeper from the time of the tragedy, a gruff, solitary man named Elias Thorne. The inscription beneath the photograph read, "Elias Thorne, Keeper of the Light." His weathered face, etched with lines of hardship and experience, held an unsettling air. Sarah felt a sense of foreboding. He was the link to the past, the one who had witnessed the tragedy unfold. Elias Thorne had been a recluse, a man shrouded in mystery. He had disappeared from the town shortly after the tragedy, leaving behind a trail of rumors and whispers. Locals spoke of his troubled past, his haunted gaze, and the dark secrets he carried within him. Sarah's intuition told her that Elias Thorne was the key to understanding the murders. Determined to find him, Sarah scoured the records, searching for any trace of his whereabouts. She tracked him to a small fishing village on the other side of the coast, a place where he had settled after the tragedy. The village was a world away from the bustling city Sarah had left behind, a place steeped in tradition and mystery. Sarah's arrival in the village raised eyebrows. The townspeople were wary of outsiders, particularly one who was interested in their past. They exchanged hesitant glances, whispering amongst themselves as Sarah approached the old fisherman's shack, where Elias Thorne now lived. Sarah knocked tentatively on the weathered door. Moments passed before a gruff voice called out, "Who is it?" Sarah cleared her throat. "My name is Sarah Jones. I'm a journalist from the city. I'm here to talk to Elias Thorne about the tragedy at the lighthouse." The door creaked open, revealing a hunched figure in the doorway. His eyes, faded and filled with a lifetime of hardship, met Sarah's gaze. She saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a fleeting memory of a time long past. "You want to talk about the lighthouse?" he asked, his voice raspy and low. "Yes," Sarah replied. "I think you might have some information that could help me understand what happened." Elias Thorne hesitated, his gaze lingering on Sarah's face. He could see in her eyes the determination, the unwavering pursuit of the truth. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to allow her entrance. The interior of the shack was dimly lit, filled with the scent of salt and the faint aroma of fish. Elias Thorne gestured towards a rickety chair. "Sit down," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I'll tell you what I know." Sarah took a seat, her back stiffening as she felt the weight of his gaze upon her. He seemed to emanate a palpable tension, his presence both unsettling and magnetic. "The tragedy at the lighthouse," Elias Thorne began, his voice echoing in the silence of the shack, "was a terrible thing." "I know," Sarah replied. "I've been reading about it." "It wasn't an accident," Elias Thorne said, his voice shaking with emotion. "It was deliberate. Someone caused it." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Someone deliberately caused the accident?" "Yes," Elias Thorne confirmed, his gaze fixed on the floor. "They did." The words hung heavy in the air, sparking a surge of adrenaline within Sarah. This was a revelation, a clue that could break the case wide open. "Who?" Sarah pressed. "Who did it?" Elias Thorne looked up, a flicker of fear in his eyes. "I can't tell you that," he said. "It's dangerous. They're still out there." "But who?" Sarah insisted. "Tell me, Mr. Thorne. It's important." Elias Thorne shook his head, his hand trembling as he gripped the armrest of his chair. I can't tell you. Please, don't ask. Sarah saw the fear etched on his face, the deep-seated anxiety that consumed him. She realized that he knew something vital to solving the murders. She needed to find a way to convince him to tell her, to break down his wall of silence. Mr. Thorne, Sarah said, her voice soft but firm. I understand your fear, but I need your help. These people are targeting the victims based on their connection to the lighthouse. I need to know who caused the tragedy, who's responsible for these murders. Elias Thorne hesitated, his gaze fixed on Sarah's face. The weight of his past, the burden of the tragedy he had witnessed, seemed to weigh heavily upon him. Sarah waited, her heart pounding in her chest, as if she could hear the ticking of a clock counting down the seconds. Finally, Elias Thorne spoke, his voice a barely audible whisper. It was me. Sarah's breath hitched. The words, though unexpected, confirmed her suspicions. Elias Thorne was the connection, the missing piece of the puzzle. You? Sarah questioned, incredulous. Why? How could you? It was a terrible thing, Elias Thorne said, his voice filled with regret. I was in love with one of the girls who died. I couldn't stand to see her with anyone else. So, you caused the accident? Sarah pressed. To get rid of your competition? Elias Thorne nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. It was a terrible mistake. I thought if I could get rid of the others, she would be mine. But you made a terrible mistake, Sarah replied, her voice trembling with emotion. You took innocent lives. You caused so much pain. I know, Elias Thorne whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I've lived with the guilt for years. I thought I could escape it, but I was wrong. It's always been with me, a shadow that follows me everywhere. And now it's out to claim more lives, Sarah said, her voice firm. The killer is seeking revenge for that tragedy. They're targeting the people who were involved, who witnessed your terrible act. Elias Thorne's body shuddered as he sat there, his gaze fixed on the floor. The weight of his guilt, the realization of the ripple effect of his actions, overwhelmed him. I'm sorry, he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. I'm so sorry for what I've done. It's too late for apologies, Mr. Thorne, Sarah replied, her voice firm. But it's not too late to stop this madness. You can help me bring the killer to justice. Elias Thorne looked up, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and despair. How? What can I do? Sarah's gaze met his, a determination shining in her eyes. Tell me everything you know. Tell me about the killer, about their motives, about everything you know about that night. Every detail counts. As Elias Thorne began to speak, Sarah felt a sense of relief wash over her. The truth, however dark and disturbing, was finally coming to light. The lighthouse secrets, long buried in the sands of time, were now coming to the surface, threatening to expose the hidden darkness that had haunted the town for decades.